welcome everyone to this roundtable discussion on inclusive digitalization, and many thanks to everyone for joining today. The discussion is being co-hosted by the International Telecommunication Union, the World Benchmarking Alliance, and Fidelity International. I am Christine Bruschi, a member of the Sustainable Investing team at Fidelity International and lead of our initiatives that concern the digital economy, in particular questions related to sustainable digital inclusion and what at Fidelity we are calling digital ethics. For as we all appreciate, the economy and the world are increasingly and in so many ways digital. The UN Secretary General highlighted in the roadmap for digital cooperation that the COVID-19 pandemic has magnified the many benefits and harms of the digital world, while revealing that digital tools have become the lifeline for millions and millions of people. However, he cautioned that lack of prompt action will risk piling digital inclusion barriers on top of many other existing barriers to development. The roadmap calls for a multi-stakeholder effort for cooperation on digital topics ranging from connectivity to artificial intelligence. The roadmap highlights the need to convene a global group of stakeholders, including governments, the private sector, and investors to advance efforts in building an inclusive digital economy and society. So here we are. We would like to thank the ITU for hosting this event, as well as the many initiatives the ITU are taking in inclusive digitalization. And I would also like to thank the WBA for hosting and organizing this event. And moreover, I would particularly like to acknowledge the WBA for the amazing work they are doing to advance the Sustainable Development Goals. And in particular, to have identified digital transformation as a key system transformation to promote the SDGs. The WBA's Digital Inclusion Benchmark, the DIB, which was first introduced in December 2020, is a key tool in measuring, monitoring, and holding accountable key companies to enable digital transformation that benefits all of society. We will hear more about this shortly, and I look forward to discussing with our speakers many facets of the opportunities and challenges of inclusive digitalization that the DIB has identified. To introduce today's program, we will have opening remarks from Lourdes Montenegro, the WBA's lead of digital sector transformation, to provide an overview of our topic. Lourdes will be followed by our two keynote speakers who will provide further context for our discussion of inclusive digitalization. We will then hear from three speakers who bring various perspectives to our topic, from the private sector to policy and civil society. And we will hear from government speakers bringing their views to the subject. And then we will hear from three panelists who contribute investors' viewpoints. We will then open, hopefully we will have saved enough time to have about 30 minutes of audience engagement. And we welcome everyone to join this Q&A and what we hope will be an interactive and lively discussion, including perhaps some brainstorming and perspective sharing that may lead us to some affirmative next steps. Then we'll end our time together with a summary, along with a call to action regarding how we may together best be able to bring about inclusive digitalization. A few quick housekeeping notes. As always, we ask that everyone keep your microphones on mute throughout the session until the Q&A discussion, and then unmute them if and when you are called on to speak. And if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, you have two options. You can use the raise hand feature in Zoom, and we'll try to call on you, or you can use the chat section to submit your questions or comments. So as mentioned, we're going to hear from our panel of speakers, and then we will open up the session for the broader discussion in which we encourage and look forward to hearing insights from various stakeholders. And as mentioned, and as you heard, the session is being recorded. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to pass the microphone to Lourdes Montenegro of the WBA for opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Christine, for that lovely and warm welcome. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the World Benchmarking Alliance, of course, along with our co-host Fidelity International and the International Telecommunication Union, I'm very pleased to also welcome everyone to this discussion, which I hope will stimulate all of us here to act together to ensure an inclusive digital transformation that respects our fundamental human rights, supports sustainable development, and uplifts the lives of society's most vulnerable. Our discussion today is especially very timely in the light of the UN Secretary General's keynote address last week, which highlighted the digital divide among the 6 great divides that we must all continue to address. Digital inclusion requires not only universal access to digital technologies, but also improved digital skills at all levels. Respect for human rights, including privacy and child online protection, as well as open, inclusive, and ethical innovation. It is an urgent and massive undertaking that requires coordinated efforts from the private sector, governments, and civil society. The private sector, motivated by growing corporate profits and market shares, has been the driving force behind digital transformation, especially in the past 2 decades. Digital technology companies in particular need to be publicly held accountable for business practices that leave behind vulnerable groups and imperil sustainable development. At the World Benchmarking Alliance, we seek to provide this mechanism for corporate accountability by publishing public and freely available data and insights on corporate performance across 7 system transformations needed for sustainable development. Our digital inclusion benchmark, which ranks and scores 200 of the world's most influential digital sector companies, revealed that the sector has yet to embrace digital inclusion as a core responsibility. The average score across all geographies and industry types is only 36 out of 100 of highest score, with software and IT service companies and especially large platforms lagging behind telecoms and hardware manufacturers. On specific metrics, the results are even more alarming. For example, only 16 out of 100 companies assessed in 2020 reported having guidance and internal governance mechanisms in place for ethical design and application of artificial intelligence. Again, on this metric, e-commerce and platforms lag behind the rest of the sector. So investors, governments, and civil society, all of us have big roles to play in holding the digital sector accountable. I understand that the allure of big growth from the tech sector is very strong. So I am especially pleased that we are joined today by our investor allies who are already starting to take steps to ensure that they invest responsibly in digital technology companies. We hope that through this discussion, we can enjoin even more asset managers and asset owners to work together in a coordinated effort to improve the digital inclusion performance of companies in their portfolios. Governments are especially key in providing the enabling environment through laws and policies. We hope the digital inclusion benchmark results can help identify areas where decisive government action and regulation is needed, especially in issue areas where business is demonstrating lack of progress on its own, as shown through the digital inclusion benchmark, for example. Civil society groups and representatives, especially when representing the grassroots interests of vulnerable groups and people from the global south, play an even more crucial role as our collective conscience, which all, and especially investors, companies, and governments, must listen to with all sincerity. We offer the digital inclusion benchmark as an added tool for our colleagues across civil society to aid advocacy for a digital economy and society that leave no one behind. Again, my warmest welcome to everyone, and looking forward to stimulating action and collaboration through this convening. Please feel free to share your thoughts and your questions through the chat, and please don't hesitate to contact us to discuss ways to productively work together following this roundtable. Thank you very much. Over to you, Christine.
Thank you so much, Lourdes. That was a really good background and overview. And now I'm pleased to introduce our first keynote speech provided by Doreen Bogdan Martin, Director of the Telecommunication Development Bureau of the ITU. Doreen was unable to join us live and therefore kindly provided a recording of her keynote speech. Which is, I can't hear it, if anyone else can.
Everywhere. ITU statistics show that 3.7 billion people, that's half the world's population, lack access to the internet. COVID has made it clear that a lack of access to digital means a lack of access to fully fledged participation in economies and societies. Having amplified the case for inclusivity, COVID has also given us the unique chance to rewrite the narrative and make digital inclusion a new normal. The question is, how do we make this happen? Let me share 3 thoughts towards this end. First, we must see inclusion as a global imperative. Second, no one can single-handedly make it happen. Multi-stakeholder collaboration should be our mantra. And third, we must use digital to build back better, to get on track to achieve the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. I will start by breaking down the imperative for inclusivity. As the pandemic began to take toll, governments and operators alike struggled with huge surges in network demand. Many of you came together over ITU's Reg for COVID platform to share strategies to cope with that unprecedented strain. And through that vital cooperation, you kept the lines of communications open when it mattered most. But inclusivity does not stop at infrastructure rollout. Connectivity must be affordable, accessible, safe, and secure. Digital skills and literacy are the other part of the picture that are necessary for people who have access to connectivity to be able to use it in ways that are meaningful to their lives. Communities need to feel safe using digital services and need to have access to content that's relevant and available in local languages. Our Connecting Humanity study shows that just getting broadband internet to the remaining unconnected by 2030 will require an investment of $428 billion US. We have a formidable challenge at hand, but with multi-stakeholder cooperation and commitment, it's possible. This brings me to my second point, that it will take all of us working hand in hand to get connectivity out to the underserved areas and to make sure that everyone has the skills to leverage it. In his common agenda, the UN Secretary General stated that humanity faces a stark choice: breakdown or breakthrough. A breakthrough will take our ability to work together, and it will also depend on digital inclusion being recognized as a prerequisite for social participation. To get there, we need to put in place the right regulatory policies to create investment-friendly, enabling environments. At the same time, we need to change our strategies and focus on implementing a whole of society approach that can deliver meaningful digital services at scale with greater return on investment. Examples of this approach include our Smart Village initiative in Niger and our GovStack initiative with Estonia, Germany, and the Digital Impact Alliance, where we're promoting scalable e-government solutions in developing countries. Ladies and gentlemen, multifaceted problems need to be tackled from multiple angles. Take, for instance, the gender digital divide. Of those left out of reach of the internet, women and girls often are amongst those most left behind. Did you know that in least developed countries, only 1 in 7 women are using the internet, compared to 1 in 4 men? Yet bringing women and girls on board as contributors and shapers of technology holds so much promise for our shared digital future. And that's why ITU co-founded the Equals Global Partnership with many partners a few years ago, and it's now grown into a network of over 100 members. The truth is, there's so much capability for innovation out there that's just waiting to be tapped into. That's why we set up the new International Center of Digital Innovation called iCODI, where we bring together wide-ranging partners for innovative connectivity solutions. Combining our resources and our networks will help to harness new ideas and to develop and improve digital ecosystems. And finally, my third point on the need to build back better, let's build back better with broadband. Given the impact of the pandemic, it has quickly become clear that digital will be the catalyst necessary to get us on track to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. That's why we launched ITU's Connect to Recover initiative with the support of governments of Japan and Saudi Arabia, where we're working to assist countries for ICT-driven sustainable and resilient economic recovery. Linked to that is our transformational initiative with UNICEF called GIGA. The pandemic has disrupted 1.6 billion learners worldwide, and 2/3 did not have home access to the internet. GIGA's mission is to connect every school on the planet to the internet and every young person to the world of information, opportunity, and choice. To scale our reach and connect even the hardest to connect communities, we just launched the Partner to Connect Digital Coalition. This multi-stakeholder alliance will work to foster meaningful connectivity and digital transformation, especially in least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and small island developing states. These are just a few of a coordinated international and intersectoral approach to the connectivity challenge. And of course, we welcome more partners. Our ability to build back better will also depend on our ability to harness data, to assess the gaps, and to gauge our progress. The World Benchmarking Alliance has been a long-term partner, and we continue to collaborate in the development of the Digital Inclusion Benchmark, regularly taking the pulse of the information society. ITU brings expertise in measuring the availability and the use of ICTs, and we provide indicators to monitor progress towards the SDGs. We're looking forward to continuing to work together, and we welcome, of course, your engagement in the ITU expert group on indicators and other meetings. As I conclude, let me take this opportunity to invite you all to the ITU's World Telecommunications Development Conference next year in June 2022. With all eyes on digital, WTDC will bring together a wide range of stakeholders to draw the roadmap for meaningful universal connectivity. Let us tap into the transformational power of digital partnerships to leave no one offline. Thank you.
Well, we would certainly like to thank Doreen for providing that fulsome overview of our topic and its importance, along with helping us learn more about the fantastic and multifaceted initiatives that the ITU is taking in the area of inclusive digitalization. We are pleased now to welcome our second keynote speaker, His Excellency, the Minister of Communications of Brazil, Fabio Faria. Minister Faria's team communicated to us earlier today that he is unable to join us live, so he kindly recorded his statement for us and has appointed Mr. Arthur Coimbra, Vice Minister of Communications and Secretary of Telecommunications of Brazil, to represent him live and to participate during the Q&A discussion later.
Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to begin by thanking the organizer of the event for the opportunity to participate in this morning's roundtable, which takes place in the context of the high-level segment of the 76th session of the UN General Assembly. Brazil has embraced digital transformation as an opportunity for the entire nation to take a leap forward. Digital technologies provide the tools for a profound transformation in government services, in competitiveness and productivity in the private sector, and in empowerment and inclusion in society. Brazil is committed to bring digital connectivity to all Brazilians within this decade, a goal that is totally aligned to the UN Secretary General's roadmap for digital cooperation. Brazil, with a total population of over 210 million, has approximately 85% of citizens living in urban areas. The country has a territory of 8.5 million square kilometers and more than 5,500 municipalities. Despite these challenges, we are making significant progress in expanding network infrastructure and providing connectivity all over the country. Today, all municipalities in Brazil have mobile coverage in their urban areas, with 4G service in 45% of them, and the remaining with at least 3G service. The most recent numbers show that over 81% of households in Brazil have either fixed or mobile broadband service subscriptions. We have a comprehensive national program to provide high-speed broadband connections to all public schools in Brazil. Today, approximately 93% of urban schools and 45% of rural schools are already connected. We plan to connect all public schools by next year. Internet use homes is also noticeable gender balanced in Brazil, with 79% of women and girls and 77% of men and boys using the internet. To further increase internet coverage and access, we have an ongoing program called Wi-Fi Brazil. These programs utilize the capacity of our national geostationary satellite to provide internet access in underserved areas, particularly rural and remote locations. We have activated over 14,000 access points with satellite connections and local Wi-Fi service too. Over 10,000 schools, over 700 health units, over 500 indigenous communities. The upcoming 5G spectrum auction, which will take place in November 4th this year, will offer spectrum in 4 different harmonized frequency bands, allowing for competitive bidding in both national and regional blocks, suitable for a wide range of new applications. This is expected to attract not only the major players in the telecoms market, but also a number of smaller regional players, which can greatly impact economic development. This is a non-collection spectrum auction with earmarked obligations that will also provide the opportunity to extend coverage of the at least 4G services to more than 9,600 villages that currently are not connected, as well as seamless coverage on federal highways, expanding our territorial coverage. I would also like to draw your attention to another digital program with high impact in terms of social inclusion and environmental sustainability that we have developed at the Ministry of Communications. It is called Computers for Inclusion. Computers are conditioned and upgraded and subsequently donated, while those that are useless are properly discarded. Furthermore, at these recycling centers, both adults and youngsters are trained in IT services, providing qualification and employability. Finally, Brazil participates in several multilateral and regional forums which focus on the digital economy and how countries can share experience and build a common understanding and policymaking in the digital sphere. In all those forums, we strive to create an enabling environment for investments by the private sector, an essential partner in building the necessary infrastructure and sharing in the benefits of digital transformation in Brazil. We look forward to further collaboration. My Secretary of Telecommunications will be joining this meeting and will be available to answer any questions, as well as to take part on the debate. Thank you very much for your attention.
Fabulous. Thank you to Minister Faria of Brazil for those observations and comments. So now we'd like to turn to our live discussion with our panelists. In the interest of time, we won't read the full bios of our distinguished speakers, as those have been provided in the program materials. We would like to begin with Paula Byrne, the Director of Sustainability for Samsung. Paula, thank you for joining us today to discuss this important topic. The question that I have for you today is a two-part question. First of all, taking a big picture view, how do you and your company think the private sector can best work with other stakeholders, including governments, investors, and civil society organizations, to advance efforts towards digital inclusion generally? And further, I note that Samsung scored well on the WBA's first digital inclusion benchmark, ranking number 10 out of the first 100 that were scored, coming in number 3 in Asia and number 4 in hardware companies. And one of the areas where Samsung has excelled in the rankings is the area of innovation, and specifically on supporting tech innovation ecosystems and ethics in AI. So we would be interested in hearing why this area is important to Samsung and what you might recommend other companies do also to advance inclusive digitalization.
Okay, thank you, Christine, and thank you to the organizers, especially to the World Benchmarking Alliance, who helped us a lot to get here today. Yeah, so just I'm Paula Byrne. I'm the Sustainability Director for Europe in Samsung Electronics. I don't think that we need to go into details of who Samsung Electronics is and what we do, but we, as a large global tech company, we are a leader in innovation with a strong support for open source standards. But along with that, we understand our responsibility for bringing technology to market and addressing the concerns of the users. So I think that we need to we have a strong focus on digital skills, AI ethics, online safety, privacy, etc. And we also need to address the concerns of the future of technology. And we do understand that a lot of that fear of technology and its uses, etc., comes from like the fear of the unknown. So for us, we put a lot of emphasis around education. So that kind of brings me to maybe answering your first question, in the sense that there we realize our limits. As large as we are and as global as we are, we really need to work with partners to listen to them, to understand, to learn from them, to work with them to find solutions, put our heads together around. But mainly around education, we need to engage with at local level. So a lot of our people are engaging at local level with ministries of education, schools, teachers, kids, universities, students. And so in order to do that, we really have to have a strong network of partners and collaborators, and especially I think a lot of help comes as well from civil society, so local NGOs who have the know-how, the how to get access, and help us build those bridges safely with users. So I think that's probably the main thing. An example of that is Samsung Innovation Campus. So for example, we work with local ministries, schools and NGOs in many places across the world to help the youth land a dream job. So the idea is to really help them best respond to the educational needs of the region. So it's the region that decides what they need. It's the local, it's the schools, it's the students, it's the young people themselves who decide what do they need. And then it's our role to kind of see if we can help them realize those needs, or where do we fit in helping them. Also in terms of just designing the education programs and helping to see how we can equip students with practical skills for the future. Because I think knowledge of technology, use, how to use it safely. For teachers and students, I think that's really key. I think the third, probably the final in terms of collaboration, I have to give a mention to the World Benchmarking Alliance and the Digital Inclusion Benchmark, because it's the first time we've participated. It was launched last year, and being part of that really has helped us assess ourselves. So we are assessed, but we also, it opens up a dialogue with a wide variety of stakeholders, like the investment community, World Benchmarking Alliance, governments, NGOs, etc. But it also helps us engage internally with our internal stakeholders. So it gives us new ways to dialogue internally and say, okay, they're asking this question, who has the answer to this question? Or how do we work on this? Do we work on this? If we don't, why don't we work? So I think that really helps us also assess ourselves, I think, and ask ourselves some questions. And then I think many companies suffer from this as well, and of connection internally. You know, we're all busy with our day job, so it's not always easy to connect internally. So I think internal stakeholders are really key. The second part of your question, probably I use the example of AI ethics, and that's also speaking about our internal stakeholders, so the employees. We believe in devoting human resources and technology to develop the best products and service for society. We've established an AI vision for AI tech. And we have 5 R&D centers across the world, so the US, Canada, Korea, UK, and Russia. So that also gives us a strong interaction and different and diverse views from a global perspective. We have a very user-centric focus on our AI, so meaning always there, always safe, always helpful, and always learning. So I think the last one is probably the most is key in terms of we are constantly learning and updating and changing and identifying gaps and making improvements. And that is that we have set in principles for AI for ourselves, and we communicate about that. So those are the 3 are fairness, transparency, and accountability. And I've talked about our R&D capacity, so we've enhanced that and with the 5 centers. But we also have internal guidance and policies for our employees, so that it's embedded in all the work that we do. So whether you're an engineer or you're like me in sustainability, or you're on manufacturing, you are always thinking in that way. So this, I think, constant training and constant learning is key for us internally. I think the other stakeholder that's also key, and that's something that we what you mentioned around innovation ecosystems, is that we are not, it's not just Samsung Electronics. We work in a supply chain, in a value chain, and we really have many programs in all throughout all our supply chain work, but it also in development of technology. Working with our suppliers is key, and having that win-win partnership with them in terms of, we are only successful if our suppliers are successful in terms of their capacity, they're growing, they're making profits, they're employing, they're ensuring their well-being of their employees, providing employment, etc. So we use a lot of these programs to engage with our suppliers and help them to. We provide kind of consultancy and expertise. So we send out teams to work with them, look at how they're working, where they need improvement, training, etc. And so that's really a philosophy, I think, at Samsung is also to spread that knowledge and support, so that we're building from a strong basis, basically.
Paula, you said so many interesting and positive, encouraging things with specific examples. I really appreciate it. And I hope that many other people will have questions and comments on the information you've provided. Really interesting. Thank you so much. Next, thanks. Next, we would like to hear from Felipa Amanta, who is head of research at the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies. So sort of representing a policy take on things, the question that I have for you, Felipa, is what role can and should regulators play to ensure practical policies are put in place to promote investments in the digital sector that will in turn promote the concepts of digital inclusion. So do you think this is something that regulators have the resources for, or is it something that the private sector will be leading by default for some time to come with self-regulation, for example?
Thank you so much, Christine, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much to the ITU, WPA, as well as Fidelity International for the opportunity to share our perspective based on our research from the Indonesian digital economy landscape. So I think just a quick brief of introduction, we have been looking at the digital economy policies as a nonprofit think tank because we do believe that digitalization can bring inclusive growth, provided that it is supported with an enabling regulatory framework. And we heard the statistics before in the keynote speech that half of the world's population are connected to the internet and do have mobile phones. But at the same time, that means there are still half of the population who do not have access to these benefits and are left behind. And unfortunately, this is also concentrated in developing countries like in Indonesia. And access is only the first level of inclusion. I think, as Paula earlier said, digital skills, literacy, awareness of cybersecurity, and data rights are also very essential so people can utilize the benefits of digitalization. And again, here you see a stark difference between developing and developed country contexts. So we're seeing a divide within the country, but also between countries globally. And there's where a regulatory framework on a national level, but also at the regional level and global cooperation even would be very essential to ensure that digital economy is inclusive. And developing countries like Indonesia have really shifted their focus to accelerate the digital economy and digital inclusion. And this effort are aimed towards reducing inequalities and also to mitigate the risks in the digital economy, especially for vulnerable and marginalized communities. And to do so, I think critical investments in innovation, digital infrastructure, and technology must be built upon strong coordination between government and non-government stakeholders like private sector and also civil society organizations. And I think for this transformation to take place, government institutions and policymakers do have a crucial role to set up that clear and coherent regulatory framework that will facilitate and incentivize private sector participation, investment, and innovation. And at the same time, policymakers must also build safeguards to protect users' rights without stifling private sector investment and innovation. But to achieve this balance of the right amount of safeguards without actually stifling innovation and providing the right amount of facilitation and enabling framework is very difficult to achieve for governments, especially because the traditional policymaking processes are quite unequipped to keep up with the speed of innovations or to address the information asymmetry that's happening in the digital economy. And I think we see that state-centered digital governance have resulted in legal uncertainty or overburden for private sectors, which actually undermine investments. I think an example here in Indonesia, like unclear local content stipulations or restrictive content moderations or vague and costly data management governance have discouraged private investment, especially from foreign companies. So therefore, an accommodative approach like a co-regulation, for example, should be considered. And that means a sharing of responsibilities between government, private sector, and also civil society. In tackling some of these challenges brought by rapid digitalization, like data governance, digital divide, excuse me, and also uneven digital literacy skills. So one example of this is the regulatory sandbox adopted in the financial technology sector in Indonesia, which has proven to be very successful in stimulating innovations that results in more inclusive financial services, especially for those who are previously unbanked. And this is a really good example that hopefully will inspire further co-regulatory approaches between governments and private sectors to ensure greater investments in digital economy. And last but not least, just to answer the second part, this I think should be driven from all sides. Government should acknowledge their limitations and open up the space for private sector and civil society participation. But private sector can also continue to self-govern ahead of the regulatory framework and also to keep dialogue and to keep frank and accountable process with the government as well, And last but not least, civil society can also advocate for greater space for these kinds of dialogue. And I think the ones that we are currently having right now is also a good example of how all parties can meet and share perspective. And I really do hope that we can continue to do this more. And so thank you so much. And I really look forward to the discussion later on. Back to you, Christine.
Thank you so much. That was really helpful. Next, we would like to be joined by Allison Bryant, who is Senior Vice President of Research and Enterprise Lead for Technology and Digital Equity at AARP, which is formerly called the American Association of Retired Persons. And the question that I have for you, Allison, is how can digital technology companies seek to ensure digital inclusion for a diversity of populations, including older populations? So how do you balance and think about balancing the benefits versus the risks to various people, such as elderly people, when you think about things like data privacy and data security?
Yeah, great question, Christine, and thank you for moderating, and thanks to the WEA and the ITU for putting this on. So let me just start with being succinct. Digital inclusion across all ages is good business. So I think if we start there, that's probably a good place to start. So in the context of older adults, which is the focus of AARP, we know that there is this disconnect between the size and the impact of the group and their level of digital connectedness. So if we look globally, by 2050, about 20% of the global population is going to be 60 plus. And right now, that's already the case for those over 65 in OECD countries. So we're really seeing a point where this is going to become an even more significant portion of our population. And they have tremendous economic impact. So we've been looking at measuring this longevity economy, and in the US alone, the economic power of the 50 plus, if we look at GDP, would make it the third largest country in the world behind US and China. And by 2032 in the US, it's going to be half of our GDP. And they're also part of, it's not just sort of traditional economics and the economy, it's also the innovation ecosystem, which I think is important when we start to think about these issues. Right now in the US, a quarter of new startups and businesses are started by people who are 55 to 64 years old. And then you start putting in unpaid labor like caregiving and volunteerism, which is huge, not just economically, but also the fabric of society, and also really critical when we think about digital inclusion and connectedness. And the impact is even larger. So that's all, I think, good context to understand then this crisis of the fact that then less than half of older adults are digitally connected. So for us to think about digital inclusion and address the issues that you talked about, the sort of balances between the benefits and the potential drawbacks of digital technology and innovation, I think we need to do two things. I think we need to collectively act and look at how we have an ecosystem approach to action, and also really actively address critical barriers for older adults. And at AARP, we have really come down to 5 key barriers that we see to digital inclusion of older adults. Although I will say, I've done a lot of work across the age span, and really this framework is a good way, I think, to think of underserved populations more generally as we're addressing them. So those 5 barriers are awareness and interest of technology, it's access and cost, both looking at infrastructure like high-speed, low-cost internet, but also to the devices that sit on top of that infrastructure that actually connect people to the experiences. There's knowledge and adoption, right? Things like digital literacy, or even just getting technology installed. Who's going to help me if it breaks? Those are big questions that we hear from older adults. User experience and design, including them in the design process. In fact, that's something, having done a lot of user experience design work, they're not always certainly the first group that's included, and often not the second and the third. And then issues of trust and privacy, which you sort of hit head on. And I think when it comes to data privacy and security issues, for example, although older adults do have they have more concern about that than younger generations right now. And it does sometimes prevent their initial adoption of technology. First of all, their concerns are not necessarily unwarranted, right? I mean, the concerns that they have are topics that, along with other ethical issues, we need to be addressing for people of all ages. And so I think that, yes, they may have some particular concerns or stronger concerns, but we need to be addressing these, more generally anyway. And I think finally, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier from a user experience perspective, but even more broadly, I think the key to all of this is really including older adults in the development of technology, in the development of digital experiences, and in policies. So, their use cases, their need states, those are things that tend to be considered secondary or even tertiary to other groups when we're looking at this. And yet, as I started off, they're such a critical part of the vibrancy of our economies and our societies. So we really have to include them up front and think inclusively. Think about designing at the edges and then bringing into the larger population as opposed to sort of putting them at a later part of development.
Gosh, so much to think about, and definitely including elderly populations and those risks and benefits. I've thought about it a lot with members of my family, and I look forward to comments people might have. And I was thinking, I know we have a number of speakers still lined up, but if anybody has questions or comments they want to put in the chat now, we can start to sort through them and be prepared to efficiently try to get everybody's input when the speakers are over. We'd also like to ask if you're excited about this topic and want to share it. I think you're hearing the theme that we all need to work together. We can remind you to tweet, please, using the hashtags #UNGA for the UN General Assembly and #digital inclusion. So we appreciate your participation on that front. We are now going to speak with some government representatives. We have 3 with us today, and just one question, if they could each speak to for a couple of minutes. Dr. Albert Antwi Boisako is from he is the National Cybersecurity Advisor of Ghana. Very pleased to have you here today, Dr. Albert, as well as Ms. Marie-Louise Vigne, the Senior Policy Advisor on Digitalization for Development at the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And as we mentioned, we have Mr. Arthur Coimbra, Vice Minister of Communications and Secretary of Telecommunications of Brazil. The question that I would like each of you, if you could just spend a minute or two addressing, is how can governments work with the private sector and investors and civil society organizations best to achieve digital inclusion? Yes, Dr. Albert, you please go right ahead.
Grace, thank you for the opportunity, everyone, and also participants for making time to participate in this dialogue. I think first of all, I would like to express our appreciation to organizers, the ITU, the World Benchmarking Alliance, and Fidelity. I think it's an exciting conversation, and we're happy to have been invited to contribute to the discourse. I think I want to put something in perspective from the standpoint of Ghana. Our focus on digital inclusion started even what I refer to as a pre-COVID era. I understand COVID-19 has certainly brought a lot of momentum, a lot of focus on digital inclusion, but early part of 2020, before COVID actually came into being, within the Freedom Online Coalition, Ghana collaborated with the Republic of Germany to develop a digital inclusion statement. And that was outdoored during the FOC conference in Accra. That was in February. So we, from a development standpoint, absolutely, we felt it so much. From our experience, there was a need to bridge the digital gap even before COVID came in, which has served as a catalyst. So I wanted to put this in right context and then to look at, there are several dimensions of digital inclusion. I think Lourdes and others who have spoken earlier has identified some of the few dimensions. It's not one, it's a multi-dimensional issue. But at least from the Ghanaian standpoint, let me identify 4 critical dimensions. One is a lack of connectivity in the unserved and underserved communities. This is a real issue from our end. How are you addressing this? I think the government is setting up ICT centers across the country, mostly in underserved communities, but also rural telephony project underway to ensure there is connectivity in the areas. in the areas in which the big telecommunication operators are not investing much so that we can be able to connect to this population. So that is one. The second is what is considered the digital gender divide. I think Doreen in her speech mentioned about that. That is also a big issue. If you look at the statistics, there's a huge disparity between even those who have access, between boys and girls. So that has also been identified as an issue that requires deliberate government intervention. How are we addressing that? I think ITU has introduced the Girls in ICT program. And in Ghana, I think we've taken this like a World Cup. We started doing once a year, but currently the Minister for Communications, Honorable Esla, who is a female, is championing this. And we haven't, we're taking this outside the capital to the remote regions as well, building capacity, motivating them. I was in one of the newest created regions a few days ago. The impact is huge. The transformation, young girls given the opportunity, being mentored, being trained. And that is how we are addressing the digital gender divide. There is another dimension of digital inclusion. Child online protection is one critical issue. Where I sit, even those who are fortunate or privileged, in quotes, to have access to devices and connectivity are also confronted by certain risks. The risks of the contact they establish, the risks of sometimes their own conducts, and the risks of the content that they consume on the internet. And I think that is also a cybersecurity issue, but I believe is a digital inclusion issue. We need to address the risk aspect of connectivity to ensure that we are guiding the ICT development of our children in a manner that is secure, safe, and consistent with developmental orientations. The last one, which we have not recorded, that is the internet disruptions, or what is normally called the internet shutdowns. I think that has also dominated, speaking from the wider African context, there has been some few unpalatable experiences that has led to, internet being shut down, so on and so forth. I think Ghana has stayed away from that. But we've done something by involving the civil society actors, especially when we are passing policies and strategy and legislations. For example, Ghana recently passed a landmark cybersecurity act. We involve the civil society. There's always a need to have that balance. There are always a need by the state to protect the citizens by making sure cybersecurity measures are implemented. But it has to be balanced and proportionate. And this balancing act can be achieved once you sit down with the civil society to discuss and agree on the best way, to move forward. So essentially, these are some of the interventions we have put in place to stay aware of that. In terms of government collaboration, I wish to announce that my government has managed to get MTN. MTN is one of the major providers, telecommunication service providers on the African continent. We've gotten them with a commitment of about $2 million USD over the next 3 years to support the girls in ICT program. So we are also talking to other players as well to ensure that we bring them on board, apart from government funding, bringing the private sector, which also recognizes as a barrier, as an issue, to be able to ensure that we achieve this issue. For Ghana, I think digital inclusion is not just an opportunity, it's basically a human rights issue. And I think COVID has made that very clear. And I don't think there's any doubt. And that's why we're engaging with all stakeholders to get them on board to ensure we respond to this in the most holistic manner. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those comments. And I believe that Marie-Louise was going to speak for 2 to 3 minutes next.
Yes, thank you. I'll be mindful of that time as well. And thank you, Christine, and the World Benchmarking Alliance, and ITU, and Fidelity, of course, for offering the Netherlands the opportunity to contribute to this important conversation. We support the WBA for the development of the digital inclusion benchmark exactly because it is an excellent conversation starter to bring tech companies, investors, governments, and civil society together. in a multi-stakeholder dialogue, and to ensure that digital technologies actually live up to their transformative potential for greater equality and inclusion. So your question around how governments can engage with these different stakeholders, I would like to use this intervention to emphasize the importance, the crucial role of civil society in this regard, echoing some of the words that Lourdes Montenegro mentioned in her opening remarks. So civil society organizations can really contribute to a better fit between digital solutions and the priorities and conditions of women, youth, and for example, the elderly, as Mrs. Bryant already mentioned in her contribution. These groups currently not only benefit structurally less from digital technologies than others, but they also often face much more violence online, as previous speakers have also commented towards. Within our development programs, the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs encourages our civil society partners to engage in the design and norm setting around new technologies, together with the private sector and government, to jointly create digital spaces that are more accessible, relevant, and safer for everyone. Civil society organizations can contribute to ensuring that marginalized communities are not only treated as consumers of pre-existing digital tools and services, but are actually enabled through participation and also stronger skills to really shape the digital world. In addition, civil society is our only real chance of detecting and advocating against unintended consequences of digital technologies within society. It may be a provocative statement, but we are deeply convicted that no matter how good our intentions are or how strong our regulatory frameworks may be, no matter how well developed our ethical principles are, we will never be able to avoid all exclusion or injustice. We need sensitive and critical ears and eyes within the communities to notice them and raise awareness and advocate change. This requires political support for these critical voices on the part of both governments and the private sector. It requires an openness to really hear the priorities of those who are often not heard. It also requires financial support. And within our flagship policy framework on strengthening civil society, we allocate 1.4 billion euro to strengthen the independent political role of civil society in developing countries. To be sure, this is on a broad range of thematic priorities. But within that framework, we encourage organizations to develop their own expertise and strategies around the fast-changing developments of digitalization. To conclude, ensuring digitalization or digital inclusion really requires a bottom-up approach, and a vibrant, diverse, and well-supported civil society is key to support it and achieve it.
Thank you very much. I think we also now have Mr. Coimbra of Brazil to make a couple of comments, if you'd like.
Thank you, Christine. The question about how to involve civil society into digital inclusion initiatives is very challenging. And of course, the most fashionable answer would be to talk about community networks, which is it's a very recurrent subject. But the point is that there's a global challenge regarding community networks about their sustainability. So in Brazil, we have been easing the regulation to make it more lighter for those kind of non-commercial community-driven networks to thrive. Unfortunately, we could not manage that as we wanted to, and they have not flourished as we wish. But I see, at least in Brazil, a very important role for civil society, which is, since they are the ones that have the closest links to their communities, it is very important for us to be in contact with them, to gather information about the necessities and to oversight the effectiveness of the digital inclusion policy. So it's the quickest way to get information and to make sure that digital inclusion policies are really reaching their goal. And therefore, we try in Brazil to keep as close as we can to civil society entities for that reason. Thank you.
Thank you for drawing attention to that aspect of our cross-stakeholder discussion. The other group that I'd like to bring in now are the investor perspectives. I'm sorry we're running a little bit behind schedule, but we would definitely like to hear at the outset from the three investors we've invited formally to speak, and then afterwards, if there are other investors as well who'd like to add their input in the shortly following discussion section, that would be great. We have with us Anita Dorrit, who is the Program Director of the Investor Alliance for Human Rights. We have Lauren Compier, Managing Director and Head of Shareholder Engagement at Boston Common Asset Management, and my very own, John Guinness, a Portfolio Manager at Fidelity International. And the questions we'd like you each to touch upon before we open it up to everybody, and again, we encourage everybody to start putting in your questions or comments in the chat, raise your hand, and we'll come around to you in the time we have remaining. But the questions for the investor group are, what actions are you already taking to accelerate digital inclusion? And what barriers do you find? And how can we overcome these barriers? Shall we start, I suppose, with Anita?
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Christine. And I'm happy to kick this off. Thanks to the organizers as well for pulling this event together. Just very quickly, the Investor Alliance for Human Rights is a collective action platform for responsible investment and is grounded in the respect for people's fundamental rights, their human rights. And we use the UN guiding principles and the framework of human rights due diligence to inform and to enable how we engage and as investors embrace and undertake the responsibility to respect human rights in our investment activities. The Investor Alliance has a membership of about 200 institutional investors. We go across 18 countries and we represent over 6 trillion in assets under management. The reason we've come together is because we do recognize the importance of investors as a financial actor, a relevant stakeholder, and an owner of companies, tech companies, and that responsibility to ensure that we use our collective leverage to drive for this digital transformation. So in terms of the, what we as the Investor Alliance focuses on, so we've been working with our investor members and engaging on technology risk and human rights over the last 3 years. So together with our members, we've focused on engaging with tech companies on their corporate responsibility to respect the rights of privacy and free expression, the digital rights of users and societies. So as we've been talking about enabling digital transformation in allowing for digital access universally, this must be done in a way that protects the digital rights of users. As Doreen spoke about it earlier, we need to provide safe and secure access. And so that's one of the things that we've been focusing on. Tech companies must secure the trust of users and society, and digital inclusion cannot come at the price of disregarding the risks and harms to people's rights online. So the use indicators that the WBA Digital Inclusion Benchmark addresses is the safety of information as a key, information assets is key. And so we're talking about the protection of personal data of users. So we've seen where the collection of data of users and the sharing of that information by big tech without their consent is a clear breach of trust and the duty to respect human rights. The example of Cambridge Analytica scandal and the unauthorized use of data of tens of millions of thousands of users in that case. Another example is the monetization of users' data through targeted advertising as the business model of technology companies, which has promoted the virality of sensationalized content that enables the spread of hate speech and misinformation. Another example where users' rights have been disregarded in favor of profits. And when we talk about free expression and the ability of users' political to have political participation. This is another aspect of providing safe and secure digital transformation. So we're very concerned about how these companies respond to government and law enforcement requests, to moderate and remove content, for examples, or mandated internet shutdowns, which we have seen in Uganda recently during the presidential elections. Myanmar's military using shutdown as part of the coup attempt, and in India recently to crush the nationwide farmers' protests. So what can investors do? We want to be able to re-engage with companies in trying to ask to push to them that profit is we're looking at long-term shareholder value that brings about the transformation, the elevation, the building back better, and the respect for people and planet. So using benchmark data that is available on tech companies, investors work with data, right? This kind of data helps us coordinate how we're going to engage with companies. And how we've done this is by putting together what our investors' expectations are of tech companies. And we do that usually through an investor statement, and where we might set out what are expectations of tech companies to protect the rights of users to privacy and free expression. We've done one of that and just launched it recently, where we had more than 76 institutional investors representing more than 5.8 trillion in assets under management signing this digital statement. This digital statement, as I mentioned, is based on data from benchmark companies. It's also informed by civil society, who is really ground truthing the work that investors are trying to put in place in their engagement. And so we are very much supported by civil society as well. And we use this investor statement and that support to pursue an engagement with the companies, and usually the companies who are part of benchmark report, because there is data, comparable data that we can then converse with companies on. And we use the collective leverage of investor communities who have signed those statements. So these dialogues often, result in investors really impressing the need to look at long-term value around building back better, around digital transformation. And you asked me about barriers, right? That around how investors can engage, and it's really around the lack of publicly available information. So companies are not providing a lot of information in this space. We've seen some improvement in this area. Sorry, Christine, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was actually going to try to move to the next speaker because you've provided lots of great information. I wanted to save time, but I don't want to cut you off. I'm sorry about that.
Okay, no, I'll just very quickly say that, really pushing for more information. We need data providers to really dig deep, push companies for that data. And we ask benchmarking companies who are looking at human rights issues to really collaborate with these commercial data providers to really increase that level of data that's available. And just lastly, in terms of overcoming barriers, there's a lot of ways out there, but the one thing I wanted to highlight is really the need for legislation and more public policy on that, attention on that. And with that, I'll pause and we can take questions later. So thank you, Christine.
Thank you. There really is an endless list of topics and things we could say, and I'm looking forward to hearing our last two investors here formally scheduled. Lauren Compier, what is your and your company's take on these topics?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to mention that we're actually members of the Alliance, and so all of what Anita said, I'll just say ditto in terms of that. But I think what's really important is that we're formal users of the WA benchmark data in formalized engagements, both individually and collectively. And it's actually one of the core pieces of information we use when we're initially reaching out to a company. So that's one practical example. But I think what's really important, and I'll move to the barriers and opportunities. I think when we're talking about digital inclusion, access and affordability needs to be backed by robust data and user rights. And we also need to move the digital inclusion accountability conversation to other sectors outside of ICT, given the fact that the use of digital resources is used in a wide variety of sectors. A couple of barriers. Corporate accountability and transparency are really two main barriers, alongside obviously differentiated user rights across different markets. There are really three areas that investors need more transparency and visibility around. We need to understand really how companies are assessing impacts across a variety of stakeholders. It's not a one size fits all. So how are they assessing human rights impacts? And how is this impact actually influencing or changing business decisions? So the implementation of business decisions. 2, investors don't really have a good understanding of how human rights due diligence is done at all stages of tech development, from product development, marketing, distribution, and ongoing monitoring. Finally, one of the key barriers is we don't have a really good understanding of the use and development of AI and algorithms, and what is a standardized definition of ethical AI, which is really critical to true digital inclusion. What do we need? Many other speakers have spoken of various needs, but I want to focus on 2. 1, we need more multi-stakeholder engagement approaches like this to develop impact assessment, innovate on new models to advance digital inclusion, and an ongoing focus on accountability mechanisms, including access to remedy, and what does that mean for users. And this needs to be backed by collective engagement by investors on these core concepts. And I'll stop there.
That was a perfect segue when you mentioned collective engagement, because I'm familiar with what we do at Fidelity International, but I think I'll let John Guinness tell you a bit more.
Great stuff. Thank you very much indeed to everyone for listening to this. So in terms of the 3 questions we had, the first one was, what actions are you already taking to accelerate digital inclusion? So at Fidelity, we think about digital inclusion as doing the right thing in the digital world. And the digital inclusion overlaps strongly with our version, which is very similar, which we call the 6 digital ethics pillars, which are cybersecurity, data governance and data privacy, ethical AI, misinformation, online welfare, and digital inclusion. So in terms of what are we doing to accelerate digital inclusion, there's 2 very key areas. The number 1 is engagement, which is absolutely front and center. We've just heard about that from my 2 other panelists. You know, at Fidelity, we engage with hundreds and hundreds of companies around these topics every year, and we have been doing that for some time. As you can imagine, it gets quite interesting with companies like Facebook, but that's what we're here to do. And it's an absolutely key focus to get our view across to these companies and to make clear what we consider progress to be, and to try and get progress. And the second thing, which people haven't mentioned, but which I think is really important, is voting. So obviously we vote at the shareholder votes, and we're very, very active and getting increasingly more active. And I can tell you now that companies care a lot about how we vote. And a lot of our highest level engagements with the CEO revolve around our positions on their vote and whether we're going to vote for or against management. I mean, obviously, it's very, very impactful on senior management when we're talking about their compensation. So it's a very powerful tool, even when engagement is not having the sort of positive desired results. Now, question number 2, what are the barriers around you for doing more around these topics? Now, number 1 barrier is just the awareness of ESG and the willingness to engage. But I would say very positively, this barrier is coming down very quickly. Most public companies, even in the US, are very willing and eager to engage with us. And they see European-based companies like Fidelity International as great partners and advisors as they embrace these sustainability issues. Now, the second barrier is data. We've had people talk about this. It's a longer term problem, but I would say, again, this is quite positive. The more we engage with companies, the more companies realize the importance of digital inclusion. Companies are publishing more and more data. And we really encourage companies to publish KPIs and numbers. So it's not just a chat about sustainability, but we want them to publish KPIs that we can measure them against. And transparency is very, very important for us. I think we've seen version 1.0 in terms of ESG reports and data coming from companies, but very quickly we will see a lot more data. So question number 3, how can we overcome these barriers, and what tools or actions would help investors do more? So I think the message is actually a little bit positive in that I think there's a lot of progress being made very quickly, which is great. In terms of the first question, in terms of awareness of ESG and willingness to engage, there are a number of solutions. I mean, at Fidelity and also lots of other investment firms, we're all focusing on engagement with every company, not just the worst, even the best. You can always get better. But I would say collective engagements are very powerful. And when it's not just one investor, but many investors, as we've just heard, civil society organizations, NGOs, cross stakeholders, if we all come together, it makes an enormous difference. And therefore, together we can advance the UN SDGs. And the second point I want to make is just in terms of data. Now, firstly, companies have themselves coming rapidly forwards, providing much better data. And I believe that when the 2022 company ESG reports come out, there will be an enormous step change in the amount of data that these companies are providing. At Fidelity, we're constantly having engagements to run through which KPIs we want to see, what are the numbers we want to see and why, what are other companies doing, benchmarking companies against each other. It takes time for companies to collect, check and collate the data, but I believe it's definitely coming, which is a very positive thing. And lastly, we want outside companies as well, not just us, to analyze the data and look at it. And that's where things like the digital inclusion benchmark that the WBA have produced is so important, because it helps us all speak a common language when we're engaging with companies and really helps us solidify a certain number of KPIs, which we can then use to engage and compare and contrast between companies. So that's all I've got to say, but I would say the message is broadly positive, which is a good thing. Thank you.
John, thank you so much. So our time has shrunk, and again, I apologize for that. There are so many interesting things going on from so many different sectors and across all of these dimensions of how we're looking at digital inclusion. We would really like to get some involvement, some comments, some questions from those of you that have spent the last nearly 90 minutes listening to this. I would encourage, if it's a comment, perhaps we can put it in chat so everybody can see it and share it. If it's a question, you can also put that in chat and we'll do our best to answer it. But if you could use the little raise hand feature and I can look around the screen and call on people. I would like for a moment, if I can, to stick with the investor response and activity since we're on that topic. And I think we have some other investors on the call. And by the way, if people aren't unwilling, it's kind of nice to go on to video so we can see each other and feel like we're more engaged. If you're willing to do so, that would be appreciated. But one person I hope would be willing to make a comment in this regard, Mariela Vargova is an investor on the call with a big asset management firm. And I wonder if you would be willing to provide some input as to what your firm does with respect to digital inclusion.
Just a moment. Hello. Thank you so much. Excellent discussion, and thank you for the participation. Yes, I'm Mariela Vargova with Invesco, part of the global ESG team. Digital rights, digital age is a big part of our thematic engagements with many of our portfolio companies. And I really want to echo here what Lauren said and other investors. There's really need for a collective action. And this is based on a long-term experience of speaking with big technology companies on issues of digital rights as part of their human rights agenda. But I believe that in order for the community to have a leverage and collective impact, I believe it's time for us to have something like Digital Action 100 Plus to mirror what our achievements in climate change and environmental sustainability, having a benchmark and engaging with collectively with companies on scale. I think that's how the investor community, can have a positive footprint on the industry, and also will allow us to raise the bar in terms of the development, technological development of the business of these companies, but also to raise the ESG, environmental, and also social concerns like human rights. So I guess I'm calling for Digital Action 100 Plus.
That's great. And one of my closing points will be a call to action. So thank you for backing that up. I wonder if there are any other investors at this moment who would like to pose a question or provide some information about what they're doing. And otherwise, we could open it up to other stakeholders who would like to raise their hand or put in the chat. any comments or questions on these important topics.
Christine, it's Anita here. Just wanted to make one comment about what John mentioned and, the issue around voting and the importance of it in terms of signaling to companies what investors want. And I think what's very important as well is that when you do vote, and you do vote maybe against management on an issue, very important to communicate publicly what are the reasons for the way you voted, because that then sends that message and explains, the position of the investors. So just a comment that's building on what John talked about, which is critical, and I'm sure is what Fidelity does. So thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I actually don't have the ability to see the chat feature. I have somebody sending me the chat. So if you can see the chat and you want to, jump up and say something, take yourself off, unmute. And again, if you want to raise your hand, we'd be happy to call on you. I think you're maybe inundated with all of this information and exciting news about opportunities and challenges. Well, if nobody wants to raise a question or make a comment, I can go ahead and sort of move to the next point of the discussion. So it's really been incredibly fascinating and very broad-reaching, as we've all heard. If you're familiar with the digital inclusion benchmark, there are 4 pillars within which there are 16 indicators, and they do range everything from just basic access to broadband or even any sort of connectivity, all the way through to things like the benefits, the financial benefits of innovation and the use of and deployment of ethical artificial intelligence. So it's quite wide ranging, and all of us have a little bit of a different take of our priorities and where we can most affect change and where we most want to see change. Obviously, inclusive digitalization, whatever the topics within it are, it's a topic very clearly dear to all of our hearts and incredibly important to society as a whole, globally, and to advancing the Sustainable Development Goals. So we've heard from a range of stakeholders, including government representatives, non-governmental and civil society organizations, companies, and investors. We have heard a variety of solutions and initiatives underway, many of which I was not aware of, and it's really exciting to hear all of the different things that are going on, along with calls for greater action across all areas of digital inclusion and society. So this does bring us to a call for action. It's nice to talk about all of this and find out what we're doing and share what we want to be doing. Let's actually maybe here and now agree about doing something. I wanted to bring up a specific example that has come up, because we do hope that we have both a greater sense of the specific issues and some specific ways that they are being addressed and ways that we might seek to address these. But as you know, a founding principle of the WBA, which we've heard many people underscore today, and I think we all share, is that by working together across various stakeholder groups, we can affect a greater scale of change than would otherwise be possible. And we do believe that collectively we can have a greater impact. So it's for this reason that the WBA has been establishing collective impact coalitions, or KICs, you may have heard about that, across the systems transformations that they have identified, including the digital transformation and enabled by the Digital Inclusion Benchmark, the DIB. And as one example of a potential KIC, Fidelity International has offered to be a lead investor ally in a KIC for inclusive digitalization. And specifically as investors, we are quite concerned about the issue of ethical AI, and something that Lauren had also touched on more specifically. So I think you heard at the very beginning, Lourdes mentioned that the DIB found that of 100 leading tech companies, only 16 have a clearly identified policy addressing the ethics of artificial intelligence. It's astounding. We personally at Fidelity were engaging, as John mentioned, it came up through a voting issue. We were speaking with the chairman of the board of a very, very, very large tech company. And so we had the opportunity, and I asked him, could you tell me a little bit about what you're doing in terms of ethical AI? And he stopped and said, gosh, we I know, obviously, we're very active in the architecture of AI. I'm not really sure if and what we're doing specifically to focus on ethical AI. I hear what you're saying, and he looked around the table of very important people behind him and said, yeah, we're going to be looking into this. So we do have a lot of power in this regard, and it is a really important issue because I think the technology is moving so quickly. Regulators probably can't quite keep up with it, and it's something that is a huge risk from an investment standpoint. So we've been thinking a lot about what can we do. It's quite an advanced topic in terms of sustainability, but for us, it's something quite important, and we are interested in stepping up to lead, I think, along with Boston Common Asset Management, a collective impact coalition focusing on ethical AI. So this topic, we could spend another hour and a half talking about it, but I would like to sort of wrap this up as a call to action, both on our behalves on this specific kick, and of course, as well, anything in this area of digital inclusion that you would want to pursue further, you can get in touch with Lourdes and Nicholas and the WBA. So we have quite limited time. I do kind of want to wrap that up with the call to action, but to contact me if you're interested in the investor perspective on this specific kick and anything on the digital inclusion front, more with the WBA. And then I would also like to return back to sincerely thank all of our speakers for their input. I would really like to thank all of you for calling and joining in today and having the passion to care about this topic, as we know is super important. And again, we know that from the WBA DIB results, as those have elucidated in detail, commitment and contribution towards digital inclusion are highly uneven across industries and sectors and the world. So it's critical that we do work together to motivate and accelerate inclusive digital transformation. So thank you again for your participation in these goals and in today's event. And we would like to give you our best wishes to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.